Hi everybody, welcome to IS 325 module on defining the region. This is our chance to describe for you what we mean by the contemporary Muslim world and why we chose this particular approach. My name is Bill L. Smith. I'm the director of the Martin Institute and Program in International Studies here at the University of Idaho. And along with Professor Rafat Chow, who's the main instructor for the course, I helped originate this class about 10 years ago. We got together a group of academics, of Muslims, of specialists in various fields on campus and talk to them about what should be covered in a class like this. And there was a wide range of answers. In part, it's because the Muslim world itself is decentralized. What I mean by that is it's not a religion akin to Catholicism or Mormonism where a pope or a prophet sits at the center and harmonizes approaches and doctrines and beliefs from a central point. Because there's no central point for Islam, it means that there is no unified common voice for Islam, except in one very narrow context, which we're going to tell you about here in a minute. So when we sat down in 2010, there were three main reasons why we believe there should be a class like this at the University of Idaho. So the first was a simple geostrategic importance to the United States. So we had been in a 10-year period where there was lots of interaction with the Muslim world, some positive, some negative, but it's certainly something that was part and parcel of the of sort of what Americans were aware of. So this could be positive in the form of cooperation and trade and other things where we worked together with Muslim states, but also the wars that had taken place in Iraq and in Afghanistan and associated terrorism, anti-terrorism pushes that brought it to the fore. So one is geostrategic reasons. The second is it's one of the biggest cultural regions in the world. This large green swath that you see here on this map indicates the places where Islam is one of the main religions. And it's not exclusive. For example, right below this spot here in the middle on the map where it turns to purple, is Nigeria. Nigeria is a large African state that is roughly 50% Christian and 50% Muslim. So there's other states where there's a lot of influence that is Islamic. You also find that that a place like India, which here is in orange, has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, but India itself is predominantly Hindu, and Hinduism is sort of the national religion. So even though there's a big community there, they're not represented on this list. And there's several other countries as well where there's a lot of Muslims. The third is that there's just a lot of confusion about Islam, a belief, a mistaken belief that it's kind of a monolithic entity, that all Muslims believe and act a certain way, that all Muslim countries believe and act a certain way, and we wanted to explore that at the university. That's sort of why we were doing it. But the question is, what is it? And there were three main beliefs when we sat down in 2010 that as for what we should cover. So the first is, if there's a Muslim person there, then it's the contemporary Muslim world. And that really appeals to me and to the other organizers of the course on an emotional basis, but it was an impractical way to try and organize and teach a class. Because what we're trying to figure out in international studies is who are the people, what are the politics, what are the institutions and the governing belief systems of the countries in the regions and the areas in which we're studying. And so the every individual approach didn't work for that. So the next one was if a country has a predominant or a sizable enough Muslim population, then we'll cover it. But again, that means a place like India is included when India would maybe object to being part of the Muslim world. So the third idea was to use the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, an intergovernmental organization dedicated to finding common voice for Muslim countries on certain topics. So it's not a religious organization, it's an organization based on common religion. And we adhered to this as the organizing principle because these are states, 57 states, that have voluntarily affiliated because they're Muslims. In other words, they have themselves declared they're Muslim states, and in that case, we don't have to decide internally here at the University of Idaho who's in and who's out because these are the states that have said they're in. So even though there's all these different populations that you see here on this chart, and there's a lot of reasons why you would study more broadly, we chose the Organization of the Islamic Islamic Cooperation. I'm sorry, it used to be called the Organization of the Islamic Conference, and I sometimes slip into using that other name. But it's been about 10 years of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. 51 years overall as an existent IGO. So, an IGO is an intergovernmental organization. In other words, a group of countries have come together with their executive branches and decided to affiliate around some common purpose. The largest and most well known of these is the United Nations. The second largest one of these is the OIC with 57 member states. The UN has 193 member states. The OIC doesn't coordinate positions on all topics. And it only really tries to act where there's a common Islamic approach to things. And we'll talk about what that means throughout the course of the semester. And we'll talk about where it doesn't apply here in a minute. But within the OIC, there are all kinds of subsidiary and affiliate organization. There's a development bank, an organization for food security, a fund to try and promote commonality of interest, particularly among diaspora communities around the world, a university for technological promotion. They're trying to promote trade. They're studying science and technology and culture and a whole host of other things, including trying to harmonize relief efforts through the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the International Committee of the Red Cross, or the American Red Cross is part of. In Muslim states, it's not called the Red Cross, it's called the Red Crescent. And so the OIC affiliates all the Red Crescent societies together to try and do some things jointly. So because they do these things together, they try to have a common voice on topics they consider of interest commonly to Muslims. We can turn to the OIC through the course of the semester and see if there's some common perspective. But again, this is a political organization, not a religious one. So when we suggest that there are things that are ongoing, we're not trying to suggest doctrine. I don't think any of us who are teaching the course, either Professor Afat Chow, Professor Daman, or myself, consider ourselves experts on Muslim doctrine. Far from it. What we're doing is looking at the institutions that claim the Muslim affinity and seeing what they push as political or other kinds of economic or social sorts of mores. So the OIC is made up of, this will be your first test, is to name all these flags. I'm just kidding, you don't have to name all these flags at all. But the OIC has several other regional groups within it. And when you have regional groups, what happens is there are times when the OIC, even on the topics I just referred to on the previous slide, when the OIC lets the regional groups act instead. In other words, if there's something that's of interest to Arabs, which is an ethnic subgroup of Muslims, then it lets the Arab League handle that. It doesn't try to step in. When, for example, this flag over here, this flag is Suriname. Suriname is in South America. If there are development issues that are common to the Americas or to the Caribbean and Northern South America, the OIC doesn't try and step in. It lets Suriname act through the Organization of American States. Same sort of thing with the African countries. Like there are a number of things that are of interest both to the OIC and to African states, and it's only occasionally that the OIC will act if there's a common Muslim perspective. Instead, they'll let the African Union act. So it isn't as if this is the only way that Muslim states act, and it isn't as if that on these topics it's only a common Muslim perspective that prevails. It's more complicated than that, but it will again give us a chance to explore these ideas more in depth this semester. So now I'd like to say a few words about the modern history of Muslim states, where and when. And what I mean by that is the emergence of states after 1945, joining the United Nations, and what it looks like around the world in terms of how many Muslim states there are, and whether there can be an influential Muslim voice in international politics. So in 1945, at the end of World War II, there were only 7 states that identify as Muslim that were at the organizing conferences for the United Nations. So several of these took place during World War II itself, like the Allied powers were already getting together as early as 1940 and 41 to talk about what to do in the post-war era. And they were very clear that they wanted to have something like the United Nations. And Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Turkey were all party to some of these conversations. They weren't the main players because the victors in World War II were the main players. But they were there, and they were certainly there at the San Francisco Conference, organizing conference of the UN in 1945, and put their names on the original charter of the United Nations, the original signing ceremony. And the others that were independent but hadn't quite yet joined through 1950, there were 11. So by 1950, there were 60 independent countries in the world. 11 of them were Muslim. So there's only about 18% of the world's countries were Muslim, self-identified as Muslim, in 1950. But one of the things the UN was committed to was a process of decolonization. And the era of decolonization really starts in 1955, roughly, and it lasts until the mid 80s, when the countries that controlled overseas territories were encouraged to and or required to divest themselves of their overseas possessions. So some of this is a very peaceful process, and some of these states came into existence with the cooperation and assistance of the countries who used to be their colonial masters, and some were kicking and screaming where the colonial masters didn't want to come. And sometimes it's the same country that had been the colonial master letting one go kind of peacefully and fighting to retain another. So it's not like this one country was a good colonial overseer and the other was bad. They're all singular situations. But what it does mean is that from 11 in 1950, there's 48 in 1984. So the photos here represent three very different situations. One is in the 1950s when Nigeria became independent. They got their independence from the United Kingdom, and you see a very peaceful transfer ceremony here with the last ruler from the United Kingdom with the first ruler of Nigeria together. A transfer of leadership here on the slide, the picture on the right, which is the Dutch leaving Suriname in the late 1970s, also peaceful. But then you have this picture on the bottom of the really quite brutal civil war and long-term guerrilla warfare that occurred when Algeria was trying to break away from France. That didn't go over well. But in other cases, the French cooperated in leaving from states to become part of the OIC. So this process results in a time when there's 30% of the world's countries that are self-identified as Muslim, which stays roughly the same through the last part of this process, a process known as de-Stalinization, when the Soviet Union that had sort of congealed, not originally, but eventually under the lead of Joseph Stalin, split up at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. And in particular, the Central Asian states became independent, which are also states that self-identify as Muslim. So as these states become independent, the OIC also grows. So the OIC didn't have 57 members when it came into existence in 1969. And as these other states joined, then they petitioned to join the United Nations, became independent. They petitioned to join. So the current figure is 56 out of 193. That's how many UN member states there are. 56 are part of the OIC. But you may recall I said there were 57 members of the OIC. And that's because there's a little bit more of a tricky situation. That is actually one of the main goals of the OIC is to ensure wider recognition for Palestine. Palestine is the 57th state in the OIC. It's a full-fledged member state of the OIC. It is not a member of the United Nations. It has observer status at the UN, and several UN member states recognize Palestine's right to existence, but not all of them, and not enough of them to get them into the UN as an organization for a lot of reasons that we'll get to throughout the course of the semester, because the question of Palestine is an important one both to the Muslim world and to the OIC specifically. So that's how you get the 57th member of the OIC. There are also some other UN member states that come to OIC meetings as observers. That list is here on the right. And so you have 57 plus others that come and observe. So that is basically our approach to teaching about the region. It's the identity of the states that self-identify as Muslim that interests us and gives us a chance to talk to you over the course of the semester about common Muslim positions. Again, I don't want to suggest, and we don't want to suggest, that individual Muslims aren't part of the contemporary Muslim world. That's quite wrong, and I would encourage you to bump into Muslims who may be in your orbit, have conversations and explore these ideas about what is and isn't Muslim, because our idea, our approach is not the only one. It's simply the one that's our organizing principle. And we'd encourage you to explore Islam and maybe in your orbit differently, and contribute that back to the class through conversations we might have later in the semester. Anyway, our final thought is that our region, quote-unquote region, is a self-defined one that uses religion as the focus to define what the region is. The partner class we designed to this was Africa Today. That was easy. We have a geographic outline of Africa, and unless we're talking about the African diaspora, which is people of African descent elsewhere around the world, it was simple, straightforward. That's what Africa is. The Muslim world, a little bit more difficult, and that's why we're turning to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.